let me start with this. I would like to thank Dr. Cynthia Santos and Douglas and all the members of the Latinx board for organizing this activity, which requires a lot of work behind the scenes. And I would like to thank all of you for attending this activity. I apologize for the technology issues. In the past, you know how it used to go in front of the audience and jump in. So with that, I know we might be running a little bit late. So let me start the presentation. A few years ago, I was giving a lecture at a university in Bucharest in Romania to some academics and practitioners from Europe and other parts of the world. And I presented the topic of language, history, and diversity in counseling. At some point, I mentioned my personal ethnic and religious background to connect with the audience. And right after the presentation, a professor from the US actually approached me and told me, hey, you know what, Dr. Swazo, we Americans have a great sense of pride, but not a good sense of geography and history. And he said, imagine that if we, he used the term white people, have a hard time understanding who we are, I cannot imagine what those who are oppressed in our country are going through. That was a powerful insight coming from someone from a dominant group in the US. Now, I believe that the greatest gift that we can give to a person is the gift of memory. And turning history into memory is a tremendously powerful tool that provokes and creates change. Imagine if we could give as a present the gift of memory to our family members, co-workers, and clients, how different this world would be. Nowadays, people outsource a lot. We have outsourced manufacturing and the service industries to different countries. And as you know, unfortunately, we have outsourced our individual and collective memories to Google, Wikipedia, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Our computers and the internet have bigger and bigger memories, and we have smaller and smaller memories. This is not good for human beings in our daily interactions, because as we know very well, if we do not know where we have come from, how we can actually tell where we should be headed to. Simply because there are no points of historical reference, no anchors, and therefore no historical, racial, ethnic, and national compass. This is very important for Latinx groups in the US. In the absence of a historical and ethnic identity memory, we run the risk of committing the same mistakes of the past over and over and over again. Next slide, please. Can click to the next slide.
1 second. Yeah, I'm just trying to.
Okay, no problem.
There we go.
Perfect. So therefore, the gift of memory must be the most precious gift of all. The challenge that we face is that we have become a distracted, multitasking, and scattered society that knows less about the details and more about superficial generalizations. We have become attached to our cell phones as appendices to our bodies. And more than as appendices, cell phones and computers have become essential organs and limbs of our daily lives. In many ways, we have become prisoners of our cell phones. When was the last time that a couple of hours passed by without you checking your cell phone for texts, emails, or Facebook updates? What about half a day without checking? Or what about a full day, 24 hours without checking it? You see, the constant checking, the clicking, the distractions have taken away our sense of full and in-depth analysis of ideas and concepts, current events, and life in general. We are in a constant state of disarray and scatteredness. And like Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Sapiens, said, and I quote, "While you're working on a profound and serious task that required high levels of concentration and analysis, you hear a click, check the email, then a link of a video, and suddenly you're watching little cats playing, a person petting a squirrel, a baby sleeping with a pit bull, and when you look back, you lost all your concentration and focus." Hence, the disinformation campaign are designed to get you and I completely dysregulated. As Professor Harold Bloom, the author of How to Read and Why, said, and I quote, "People are adrift in the sea of the internet, and suddenly we're thinking about irrelevant and nonsensical things." Over a month ago, and stay with me, I have a point with this. Over a month ago, a study published by the American Economic Review discovered that in the first 2.5 years of the platform's existence, college students who had a Facebook account on the site were 7% more likely to suffer from depression and 20% more likely to suffer from anxiety. There are hundreds of studies that have been published around this topic, but the unique design of this study found a direct correlation. Another example related to the effects of technology and the way we think is the city of Chicago. One can be fined for jaywalking if you've been in Chicago and for going across the street while checking the phone. Why? Because pedestrians have been killed by taxi drivers and other distracted drivers while checking their phones. Certainly, technology has been a blessing, no doubt about it. And yet, we have lost something in the way: concentration, steadiness, sensitivity, and personal social awareness. Similarly, ethnically diverse groups, including Latinx groups, have fallen victims of these social media platforms because by not having a strong intellectual structure of control at home, they've been consuming atrocious amounts of unfiltered information from the internet that creates mental images of who they should be, how they should act, and nothing that solidifies a strong sense of cultural identity. Federico García Lorca, de Granada, España, decía, "Dime qué lees y te diré quién eres. Tell me what you read, and I tell you who you are." We can deduct that if one has a defective language because of consumption of unfiltered information, one has a defective way of thinking as well. Moreover, the question is, what informs my culture? What is feeding my culture? Do I let others and the masses to inform my culture and dictate the parameters of my culture? What do I consume intellectually that molds my culture and my identity? So let me continue with this question that might seem redundant. Do you think that the idea of ethnic identity development is important? I would assume that the overwhelming response should be yes. Sometimes we talk about ethnic identity as a very vague concept that some people struggle with, especially in the US. And it makes me think what has happened with our collective memory. And I realize that the gift of ethnic identity memory is needed more than ever. Douglas, you can click to the next slide. Let me address the concept of identity. We know very well that this is not a unidimensional construct, especially when it pertains to cultural, ethnic, racial, and national identities. For some people, it might be a straightforward concept. For others, no. So if I ask you this question, next slide, please. What is your cultural, ethnic, religious, racial, and national identity? What would you say? Think for a moment. What would you say? Imagine that you come across someone and ask you that question. So as a point of reference, I have been fortunate enough to begin teaching the multicultural counseling class since 1998. So give or take about 24 years or so. And I have been very fortunate to have taken 16 groups of graduate students abroad for faculty-led immersion group, courses to Guatemala, the Yucatan Peninsula, in Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Nicaragua. So, and based on my past experiences, including workshops led in agencies and hospitals and schools, there have been many, many, many types of responses about the question that I just formulated. Overall, many people must realize, maybe must really think, ponder, and reflect on it before giving a thoughtful and articulate answer. And overall, here in the US, we tend to have what we call a binary or polarized identity. Next slide, please. That is one or the other, this or that. A very distinctive, clear category from the other. However, this is not the norm for everyone. So one of the effects of the global intensification of mobility is the formation of multicultural and transnational identities involving individuals with different citizenships, passports, as well as linguistics, religion, and cultural backgrounds. Next slide, please. So, for example, I am personally a US citizen myself and very proud of it. I love this country. Next slide, please, Douglas. I love this country as it has given me so many opportunities for development, growth, and education. Also, I'm a European Union citizen from Spain, and I'm a non-resident of the south of Spain and typically participate in the European parliamentarian elections. I visit Spain about once a year, and I feel very much connected to the Southern European culture. Also, I spent the first part of my life in the US, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Therefore, I'm very much attached to the Latin American Caribbean culture and the idea of being a Latinx as well. And in addition of the three previous intersectionalities or identities, I'm also of Sephardi Jewish descent. I observe Judaism as my religion and faith. I'm a member of a local synagogue and another one in Spain. Also, if I wish to, I can obtain the citizenship of the nation of Israel if I make what we call aliyah, meaning the law of return and going to Israel. On top of it, soon I'll be applying for provisional residency in the Republic of Turkey. So I speak, read, and write Spanish at home. I read the Jewish prayers in Hebrew and Spanish at home, and in Hebrew and English at the synagogue here in town in Iowa. I keep track of the events in Europe and Spain, Israel, Latin America, and the US. So I have what some people call the diasporic cultural identity or multinational identity. Some people call us confused, although, you know, for us it's fairly normal, is the way of living. So perhaps other people may find it really strange. For us, it's normal. So in other words, in the words of Facundo Cabral, no soy de aquí ni soy de allá. Mi país de origen es solo una habitación más en lo que se constituye mi casa. I'm not from here, I'm not from there. My country of origin is just one room within my own house. So now, I have come to the realization that in order to develop self-awareness and a strong sense of ethnic and multicultural identity, we must be able to understand how reality is constructed. Next slide, please. So in order to develop a healthy ethnocultural identity, we must determine and filter the input from outside. And therefore, we must have a set of filters or layers that allow us to distill the relevant from the irrelevant, the consequential from the inconsequential, the substance from the fluff, and the perpetual and durable from the ephemeral and temporary. Let me provide two illustrations, and bear with me, to underscore the concept of cultural realities and the way they're constructed by the media and the collective. Next slide, please. In 2001, some of you might remember that there was a case, I believe it was in California, in which a driver experiencing road rage and being really furious because of a woman driving her car tapped his car from behind. He stepped out of the vehicle, approached her car, and took the little Chihuahua dog, Leo was the name, that she had in her lap, and threw it against the upcoming traffic, to, of course, the demise of the poor dog. As a result, this event made headlines. It went viral, cover pages nationwide, articles, editorials, columns, commentaries were written, and hundreds of thousands of dollars were raised through charities and fundraising activities. Shirts were produced, TV interviews, you name it. Of course, the actions of these men were detestable as a result of a despicable act of road rage, and the life of Chihuahua is important, no doubt about it. However, what is disturbing is that during that precise time, an earthquake hit Gujarat, India, causing more than 20,000 deaths. 20,000 human beings died. Nonetheless, the US media hyper-magnified the horrors committed against Leo the Chihuahua and the vicarious trauma experienced by thousands of people as a result of this act, while dedicating a second or a third page to most national papers to the event in India where 20,000 lives were lost. Bear with me. Fast forward 2011. This is, and I love this story as well. This is the headline. Angry customer firebombs Taco Bell because his chalupas had too little meat in second attack on chain. Next slide, please. This is a portion of the article, verbatim. An angry fast food fan fed up with the lack of meat in his takeaway Taco Bell meal decided to make a stand by throwing a Molotov cocktail through its drive-through window. The irritated customer firebombed the building in Albany after calling in a complaint that his chalupas were not as he wanted. This event, listen to this, generated a lot of ink, media, and articles pertaining to chalupa and anger. However, at the same precise time, An earthquake measuring 6.3 in magnitude hit New Zealand, killing 181 people. At the same time, this story was delegated actually to the back of the national papers. So what is the point of all this story? You, I, we need to determine by ourselves what type of reality has been constructed for us in a collective way by the media, and what is truly important to you as an intelligent human being. Next slide, please. Realities are a collection of images constructed or deconstructed by words, and this is connected to my previous presentation. We construct or deconstruct the world around us with words. And as these words are formed, depicting or surrounding realities, our self-awareness is created or constructed. Look, we ascribe importance to things in a very arbitrary fashion, as we attach values and beliefs and norms to things. As an illustration, what comes to your mind if I say the word fabric? Next slide, please. We use fabrics for clothing, shirts, pants, hats, handkerchiefs, socks, towels, you name it, right? On the other hand, what comes to your mind if I show the following? Next slide, please. And the next slide as well. The next slide. The next one. Perfect. These are flags, and things change, right? These are made of fabrics. You may say, well, yeah, it's fabric, but they represent a lot of things: patriotism, honor, a country, a culture, values, prestige, a people, freedom, much more. For instance, what comes to your mind if I say the word paper? Paper. Next slide, please. And the next slide. Thank you. A paper can be used for books or notebooks, burned for fuel, used for napkins, toilet paper, you name it. We know that it comes from trees or recycled materials. However, what comes to your mind if I show you the following slides? Please, next slide. The following. Next. Okay, very good. So all these slides of money represent a lot of things: wealth, access, power, lots of work, accumulation, importance, influences, you name it. And if I show you these slides, and that is the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, I think next slide too. These are made of paper, just normal paper. But these books are holy, right? And should not be desecrated because they represent a people, a faith, history, cultures, values, norms, beliefs, a source of wisdom, the word of God, right? Next slide, please. So symbols, and this is my point, symbols are created culturally and linguistically. If a person does not know anything about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and any of the major faiths, burning their books, breaking them, using them for fuel, or any other purpose does not mean anything, because there are no values or beliefs attached to them, right? However, if a group of people know about the importance of the other, that the other ascribed to these symbols, they know that they can inflict pain, That's why flags are burned, Bibles and Qurans are desecrated, and churches and synagogues and mosques and cemeteries are degraded and disrespected with graffiti, because there are values and beliefs attached to them. And therefore, next slide, please. Cultural realities are a collection of images constructed or deconstructed by words and ideals. Symbolisms are created culturally and linguistically. For example, we human beings see the world through different lenses or prisms or filters, right? And these lenses really are, of ours, are multi-layered, very complex, very convoluted. For example, these are some multicultural filters that we hold, and depends on the individual, but values, norms, beliefs, ideals, racial and ethnic ideas, religious backgrounds, gender, sexual orientation, family histories, national identities, political views, perceptions of the others, the concept of life and death, work, leisure, acceptance and rejection, geographical location, food, music, income, SES, educational background, appearance, dress code, physical ability, age, marital status, recreational habits, monolingualism, multilingualism, etc., etc., etc. If you go over this list and define your perceptions and ideals about each one of these on the list, you will find that your perceptions are never like somebody else's. I mean, we hold different filters and perceptions are different. Because each one of us have a different set of filters, we end up seeing or hearing what we want to see or hear. Because part of what we see or hear is a selective process of cultural self-projection. Next slide, please. And sometimes these selective cultural self-projections are somewhat unique because they can project the result of a long linguistic and cultural colonial process as well. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century Jewish philosopher of Spanish descent from Amsterdam, who was actually excommunicated by the Jewish community for his radical thinking and philosophy, he said, "We are the product of many causes and effects, and everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected. Nothing is in a vacuum. In essence, we are the product of a domino effect." Like the philosopher Martin Buber said in his I Am Thou or I Am You work, he said, "We are who we are in relationship with others, never in a vacuum." In other words, and extrapolating the logic of Spinoza and Buber, those who belong or self-identify as part of the Latinx community reflect many times a series of colonial events and cultural impositions that attempted to change them or be like the mainstream. For instance, the greatest strategy of colonization by all colonial powers, and I mean all, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, was to remove the native language of the colonized. That is, from the native indigenous populations, from African slaves, and Spanish speakers from the Great Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, Nuevo Mexico. Next slide, please. That was one of the greatest strategies to disempower the people who were colonized. Since reality is constructed linguistically, stripping them off from their native tongues, deprive them from their mental schemas, archetypes, mental constructs, lenses, and worldviews, forcing them to create a new set of lenses that were equal to those who colonized them. When the mind is colonized, next slide, please. When the mind is colonized, the intellect is compromised and colonized and being held in captivity. According to Paulo Freire, the author of La Pedagogia de Oprimido, the pedagogy of the oppressed, the colonized suspects, feels, and vaguely thinks that there are things that are not right, but does not quite know how to fully conceptualize it or articulate it. Most of the time, next slide, please, the colonized and the oppressed do not know that they're being oppressed. To empower and decolonize the oppressed, one must provide perspectives and options. Without those, it's hard to have a whole picture, right? So, but those are not just a set of false ideas of an illusion or of alternatives, but real concrete steps to deconstruct, reconstruct, and modify their Latinx identity. The challenge is that identities are constructed subjectively, but also collectively. Next slide, please. Then the Latinx individual must, next slide, please. The Latinx individual must negotiate those dimensions to recreate themselves and find empowerment in the process. For instance, and this is just one example, for those of us who are native Spanish speakers, and I don't mean heritage language learners, but those who were born and raised in a native Spanish speaking country and who were educated, you know, at all levels in Spanish, you know, from middle school, high school, all the way, elementary school, college, and whatnot. Our identities are formed and consolidated through culture and language. And it's a little bit different from those who did not grow in these environments. That's normal, right? So those who do not read and write in Spanish will not understand what happens when you hear these names, for example. Julio Cortázar, Mario Benedetti, Jorge Luis Borges, Antonio Machado, Mario Vargas Llosa, José Martí, Pablo Neruda, José Saramago, Carmen Martín Gaite, Isabel Allende, Carlos Ruiz Zafón, Onetti, etc., etc. If you have not grown in that environment, it doesn't click anything. If you have, you hear those names and you make those connections to countries, states of mind, revolutions, struggles, identity, and all that. So internal meta messages, regardless of the language, it doesn't matter, English, Spanish, doesn't matter, help to construct the concept of self-identity and self-image. The challenge is how to empower a member of the Latinx community who lost the traditions of food, customs, and diet, values, beliefs, religion, and on top of it, they also lost the Spanish language and maybe any other indigenous language that they used to speak if they are members of an indigenous group. That is a challenge. So the process of decolonization implies reconquering lost ground, replanting the garden with new ideas, watering it with meaningful information, fertilizing it with intellectual thoughts, reading and analysis, and protecting it from the weeds in the form of useless information. The decolonization process for every individual is different and unique. And I personally don't have a cookie cutter approach on how to solve it. What I can say this, language is transformational. Language is the core of your being. Language nurtures you. In closing, Miguel Cervantes Saavedra, El Quijote, the author of El Quijote, said, "La sangre de mi espíritu es mi lengua. Si pierdo mi lengua, pierdo mi espíritu. The blood of my spirit is my language. If I lose my language, I lose my spirit." And I stop here. Thank you. Douglas, I don't know if we have any time for questions or thoughts or comments.
We do have some time. We have about 10 minutes, 12 minutes. If anyone has questions or comments, please feel free to raise your hand or comment in the chat.
Thank you, Monique, and Tiffany, and Emily, and Gina as well. Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest challenges, Douglas, and all the attendees that we have is how to create a space for deconstruction and reconstruction of identities that have been lost, through the process of and that is cultural colonization, linguistic colonization, spiritual colonization, psychological colonization, and how to really empower populations that have lost their identities and that are trying to reconquer that space again. And that really takes time, because we're talking about personality reconstruction, which is not easy. Case in point, how Native Americans have been devastated, by the process of colonization. And that's why people say, well, how come those vectors are so negative, as, the income, educational levels, health, and all that. Well, when you've taken everything from an individual, they lost everything mentally, psychologically, physically. They're trying to find who they are in this space, and unfortunately has happened to many underrepresented ethnic groups in the US, African Americans, Native Americans or indigenous populations, Latinx populations, including Asian populations as well. So it's been a long struggle. And so to engage in an empowerment process, it's a long journey, I would say.
I would wonder too how that translates into first and second generation Americans trying to reconquer their roots and who they are as a culture, and how to bring that into the new culture they're in the US, and how that might work as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, you're right. And even regardless of the background, I have these conversations many times in my multicultural class. And I have individuals who are Euro descent, from different parts of Europe, and they struggle in terms of how to self-identify as well. Of course, the caveat is that if you come from a European country, you're automatically positioned in a place of power and control, and that takes the equation at a different level, but you're right. It is that how to reconquer that was lost. And I think that was part of the process. I mean, there are many good things about the U.S. and but the strategy was to really remove people from that background and create new individuals separated from their countries of origin. And then, of course, language was used as a tool to integrate all of them. It was a way to prevent internal revolutions and ways of thinking. It happened with the slaves, the African slaves. When you have people from Congo, Kenya, multiple, they spoke different languages, but when you put them all together, they have to learn English and then forget their original language. And then, of course, they struggled. The same thing with Native Americans. They were, combined. And then when you mix people, then you have to lose your background and reintegrate and think like the mainstream, which was a great strategy of colonization for sure. Yeah. Good.
So many great points. Such a great presentation.